Greetings, fucks and cucks. It is I, obviously Jesus, here with the very first Patreon video for 2018, the first week of January. It's a little bit late because I was busy. I am very sorry about that, but thank you all for your continued patronage throughout last year, and I hope it will continue throughout this year, although we are very, very quickly running out of topics. So please, I don't think I've gotten those topics a submission in a while, so if you want to see more videos that don't just come out of my head or out of like random things that I screenshotted like 7 months ago, then by all means feel free to submit topics. I want this to be about the patrons as much as it is about me and my thoughts on what the patrons ask me to talk about. So an uptake in submissions would be welcome here in 2018. Make it your resolution to submit one topic to the Obviously Jesus Patreon. Hooray! But anyway, we are going to be pulling from a very old prompt today from a patron by the name of Tristan, who asked me to talk about, among many other things, the future of humanity. That's kind of a vague topic, but I am just going to talk about my personal opinions and my thoughts and my predictions for where humanity will go as a species, as a race, as a global society here in, the next hopefully 10, 50, 100 years, probably after I'm long dead, because, I've never been able to really see myself living past like 50. I find it increasingly hard as you get past 50 for me to envision a version of myself that is that old and like living a life or someone who has been living a life for that long. I don't know if anybody else gets that. Maybe that's something I could talk about in a future video if no one submits topics, but I've never really been able to imagine myself in the future, but regardless of that, I do have some sort of general ideas, more than general, I think. They do somewhat get a bit specific here, and we'll get into that in a second, but I do have ideas about where humanity is going to go, because as you know, probably, if you've watched a lot of my videos talking about, free will and determinism, I believe that on a molecular level, on an atomic level, the state of the world in one moment is predetermined by the state of the world in the preceding moment. So, I do believe that that extends to a more general sense in that the world can only go so many ways based on how it is right now. The state of things right now determines the state of things in terms of political climate and in terms of international relations as we go forward. Obviously, things can change. We can't see the future. We have to, make guesswork of it and imagine different possibilities. But I do believe that based on the world that we are living in right now and our current geopolitical climate, I do believe that the predictions I'm going to make and the ideas that I'm going to put forth in this video are pretty much based in fact. But let's go on. Obviously, it's just my opinion, of course. It's just my prediction. But, I think it's, taking into account, how the world is. But now let's get to the main meat of the video. The main meat of the video is going to be talking about my opinions on, or my thoughts on the 2 or 3 potential paths that I believe that the world can go down, and how life might resolve itself here on planet Earth, especially with our current president. I think option A is particularly likely, which is the advent of just complete and total self-destruction by one mechanism or another. We'll talk about the various ways that the main power players in terms of the geopolitical climate might wind up destroying each other or destroying themselves. And then there's option B, which is sort of split into sub-options B and C, or C and D, or whatever, which is the advent of interstellar travel, which I think can take one of 2 forms, one more segmented and one as a global society. And we'll talk about each of those subsets of the advent of interstellar travel, because there's really nowhere else that we can go. Because, even though there are big open spaces, I remember, when I was in Arizona in 2011, there's just big wide open spaces with, houses with no zoning laws, so they're all built off kilter to each other. And we probably could fit a lot more people on the planet, especially if we change our diet to require, less land for meat. There's really no What I mean by there's really nowhere else to go on Earth is that there is really no mystery left. We've mapped it all. There's very few societies in like rainforests in Brazil or some shit that are untouched by modern technology and civilization. There's very little mystery left. And I do think that one of the more redeeming qualities of the quote unquote human spirit is the fact that people are always dying to explore and go beyond our current limitations in terms of science and technology. And I do think that obviously, I mean, it's pretty obvious with how SpaceX is right now and how that's the big thing, and they get so much press, and they're pretty much leading the charge where, you know, government entities like NASA and, you know, the Russian government space program entity are slacking or failing outright. I think the stars, Mars, the moon, colonization and mining and resource grabbing on other planets is the future. And I do believe that if we don't destroy ourselves, that interstellar travel is the one way where we're going to, it's the one place we're going to look next as a kind of global society, whether or not we do that under one government banner, as you see in a lot of science fiction, or whether you do that as multiple different entities, which could be even more problematic than you might imagine. But first, let us examine option A, which is the option of self-destruction, which unfortunately I do believe is, for various reasons and because of all the different ways it can come about, the advent of just completely destroying ourselves and finding new ways to run our individual nations and our planet into the ground. I think the biggest threat, of course, at first is the big obvious one that's in the news and all over Twitter lately, which is the unwillingness for any country to completely disarm their nuclear arsenal. No leader of a country that has nuclear weapons wants to be the guy who completely disarms our nuclear arsenal for the good of the planet, because if they're the first to do it, then they look like they're making the country less safe, that they are losing their ability to keep everybody else in check. Because for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept, there is this concept surrounding nuclear weapons called mutually assured destruction, which is that if, say, the United States uses nuclear weapons against North Korea, then, you know, North Korea or Russia or some other enemy faction launches their nuclear arsenal against the United States. And for those of you who didn't know, again, all the countries in the world have enough nuclear power to destroy the planet multiple times over and make it completely and totally uninhabitable. Obviously, that's theoretical. That's if they, you know, spread the nuclear arsenal or the nuclear bombardments across the entire planet. There would almost certainly be places in the southern hemisphere that were left unscathed in a practical nuclear war between the West and the Middle East, or Russia and their allies and stuff in the, you know, in the east of China and, you know, the Korean Peninsula and everything. So practically, there would probably be some civilization that survived a nuclear war, although they would obviously be completely and totally destabilized by the loss of the entire West. But the idea of mutually assured destruction is that the world in general cannot survive the launching of a single nuclear weapon in the modern age. America is obviously the only country that has ever used a nuclear weapon in an act of war when they bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, you know, ever since then, ever since Russia during the Cold War, they got their nuclear arsenal together. Nobody has, basically the world is locked at a standstill where you cannot use a nuclear weapon without risking all-out war, all countries launching their nuclear arsenals, complete destruction of the world and society as we know it. We're talking complete wipeout of America, of Russia, possibly of China and Korea, and potentially, depending on how it escalates, places in the Middle East, with Israel surrounded by people who are all trying to obtain nuclear weapons, allegedly, sometimes in the case of Iran and stuff, that, you know, could fall into the hands of religious extremists or anti-Semites or, you know, different areas. And of course, the United States backs Israel, so if they get attacked, then there's going to be retaliation on that. So basically, nobody anywhere in the world can use a nuclear weapon without completely and totally fucking up and changing the world irreparably forever, leaving maybe like some South American or African countries as the only societies left in the entire goddamn world at the very best case scenario. So And it's because of all these alliances. It's fucking NATO and the UN, and everybody has alliances. So if one country attacks, another country will attack, and so on and so forth, and then everybody will retaliate, and their allies will retaliate. It's going to be a mess if anybody ever launches a nuclear fucking warhead, and that is why people do take it very seriously when a fucking idiot like Donald Trump or Kim Jong-un makes a statement publicly on Twitter or through North Korean propaganda. Basically the same thing for Twitter now, I guess, because the president's on it. But you know, when someone makes a nuclear threat, you know, it's easy to brush that off as just posturing, but you have to realize that on a very serious level, nuclear launch means the end of not only most likely your life if you're a resident of one of these countries, but it means the end of everything. It means the end of, I mean, just imagine everything changing in your life, and if you even bother to survive, you know, it's the end. It's the end of everything. I can hardly put it into words just how profound the change would be in society, in the world. You know, the planet would be just completely decimated by these nuclear launches. I don't even know the environmental implications of mass nuclear warfare because no one probably even bothers to research it, because there would be no one alive to even fucking care or die of radiation poisoning, except some random fucker who managed to survive in a bunker in Nebraska or some shit. But it is, I do think that this could ultimately be the downfall of the world, basically, of any kind of global society, of any kind of civilization, because like I said, nobody wants to be the guy who stripped away their nuclear arsenal first, because if America strips away its nuclear arsenal, and I mean, there are ongoing efforts for disarmament, there are talks about that, but nobody wants to be the guy who says, okay, we have 0 nukes, because either A, you're going to have to lie and keep 1 or 2 in reserve just in case, but maybe not 1 or 2, but keep some in reserve and lie at the peace talks or the disarmament talks, whatever you want to call them. I mean, or you're going to have to say, no, I won't disarm, I won't make us more vulnerable, because on some level, it does make you more vulnerable to have 0 nuclear weapons that you can use, because then the people who still do have nuclear weapons and won't disarm, no matter how good you look, or no matter how, you know, you're acting in good faith towards peace and nuclear disarmament, you're still the guy who has no nukes, who can't follow through anymore on that threat of mutually assured destruction, which in this sort of sick world in which we live, the threat of mutually assured destruction is what keeps, to some extent, people safe. Because if North Korea was the only country that had nukes, just like America was the only country that had nukes, then it might be a very, very different, we might be living under complete and total nuclear threat if North Korea were the only country, supposedly, or hypothetically, on the planet that had nukes. But no, because America can defend itself with a nuclear arsenal, and because, you know, we can form alliances with other countries that could hit North Korea, then we are in a sense more safe. And it's weird. I think it was, I mean, or it's fitting, I suppose, that I think it might have been Oppenheimer, but I forget. Somebody, when they saw the first nuclear test, they said, "Now I have become death, destroyer of worlds." And that really was probably one of the most prescient phrases ever uttered by a human being, because, you know, after the first invention and the use of a nuclear weapon, and we know what power it has based on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that was the first, that was 1945. I mean, imagine what they could do now. Imagine the advancements in technology. But from the first moment that nuclear arsenal was a worldwide reality and that everybody knew about it, the world was changed forever, because nobody wanted to be the country that didn't have nukes. Everybody had to scramble to keep up with America to keep themselves safe. And now America, when, you know, Russia got more nukes than America, if they ever did, but when Russia started getting nukes, America had to get more nukes, and then Russia had to get more nukes, and so on and so forth. And all these little countries that became intertwined in Russian and American politics in the Cold War, all of them wanted to get nukes. And, you know, Europe wanted in on the nuke action as well to defend themselves. So from the moment that became a reality, there was this undoable chain of you know, people scrambling in an arms race to get enough nukes to make themselves feel secure. And even though we are scaling back gradually in terms of disarmament, we are still very vulnerable. I mean, the world can still be destroyed by one rogue country. Now, I don't necessarily think Donald Trump's going to be the one to do it, because I don't think that Donald Trump or Kim Jong-un, I don't think they want to be the guy who disarms their country and loses that threat of mutually assured destruction. But I also don't think they want to be the guy who ends civilization as a whole. I don't think either of them is stupid enough for that. But I mean, in a world where America elects such shitty leaders, who's to say it's not going to get even worse? Who's to say that we couldn't elect a religious zealot who bombs the Middle East for Israel's sake or something, because America obviously has such a big history of Zionism and support for Zionism? Who's to say that Kim Jong-un's successor will be any more stable? The world is not necessarily at the point of nuclear destruction, obviously, but I think that based on current events, it's not unreasonable to say that we could get there. And that's what frightens me. So I think that when you look at self-destruction as a possibility for the end of the human race, the nuclear arsenals of so many different countries in this world have to be the number one threat. Because no one wants to you can't live with them, you can't live without them, basically, because they're essential for your posturing and security, but they are also what will ultimately do us in. And we exist in this weird state of nuclear limbo. It's not as felt as it was during the Cold War, of course, but we still exist in that Cold War type of nuclear limbo where one rogue person, it could come down to one person and one submarine commander with the nuclear launch key who has to turn that key to launch it from a submarine. It could come down to as few as 2 people, the end of the world, and that is scary. And, you know, countries, like I said, are like scrambling to develop their, you know, bigger and badder nuclear arsenal. Iran wants one. I mean, they say they want it for nuclear power, but I mean, who could blame them for wanting it, with the United States backing Israel and Israel having committed so many war crimes? But of course, you know, religious zealots on the Arab side of that conflict and the Palestinian side of that conflict commit atrocities in the name of Palestinians as well. Again, probably not going to make that video about Israel and Palestine, but it is, nobody is innocent on that side, but people want to have equal armaments. So more unstable people getting nuclear power or access to it. I mean, obviously I support people getting nuclear power for, you know, powering their houses and stuff, if that's what they want and if that's what they need. But turning that into nuclear weapons, obviously an understandable drive, but still very scary. Another thing I think might happen is that we will just sit in this nuclear Cold War style limbo of mutually assured destruction until we die from something else. And the most likely something else is, of course, global warming or climate change. I do think it's important to call it climate change, because then people, you know, they get a blizzard in their area like I had recently, and they say, oh, it's not global warming, look how fucking cold it is. But what they need to understand is that the climate change and the poles melting and the ice caps melting is creating these bizarre weather patterns, because, you know, they don't understand that because they're fucking stupid, moron, goddamn idiots. But anyway, you know, we have, like I talked about earlier, a lot of space in this country. We have a lot of open land that we could use to, you know, accept our growing population. Although I do think that our population did last year, if I'm not mistaken, our rate of growth declined for the first time in a while. But you know, and we talk about how you know, there's less people breeding millennial attitudes towards that and stuff. But I mean, there's still a problem where our rate of population growth, even if it is tapering off a little bit, cannot match our dietary demand for meat. Meat, specifically cows and pigs, and by extension then the dairy industry, which needs those same cows, is a huge problem and cannot keep pace with our growing population. We have to basically choose between the idea of continuing to grow our population and using our land for that and developing land for that, versus the increasing amount of land we need and the water and the other resources we need to feed so many goddamn cattle in a country that is so culturally embedded in this idea of eating red meat, and to a lesser extent the meat from pigs, and to an even lesser extent the meat from chickens. That's the order in which they impact the environment, I believe. Cows, pigs, chickens. So, I mean, America, we have this idea that millennials are somehow shifting in large numbers to vegetarianism and veganism, and I suppose that comparatively to recent generations or previous generations and in recent decades, that the number is pretty large of the increase to vegetarianism and veganism. But the problem is, for every millennial vegetarian or vegan, there are a bunch more millennial fucking dudes who watch Epic Mealtime, or I don't even know if Epic Mealtime is still around, but they maybe just watch reruns and jerk off to the bacon and Harley fucking Morenstein's beard and shit. So there is this culture, there is this very, very deeply ingrained culture of eating meat and loving it and not apologizing for it, which stands as a problem when we consider not only our population growth, but the amount of land that uses. We have cows belching methane into the sky, and of course, as a vegan, I don't think you can go ethically kill those cows to, even if you just outlawed beef and dairy production to eliminate that, I don't think you could just kill the cows, because we basically biologically engineered these cows to produce our meat and milk as a society, and I don't think we can just kill them. But you could let them, you could set aside some land for them and let them be, and they would probably taper off to a more natural level of breeding, and we could just do our due diligence and let them live out their lives as a species there, because there would probably be so few cows if we didn't need them or want them for meat and milk, because obviously, I said need, but you don't need them, because people are realizing more and more that you don't need meat, and it's very bad for your health to continually consume meat and dairy throughout the course of an 80-70 year life. So we have to choose as a society between having so much meat versus so much population growth versus so much land. You have to balance that scale, and I think that the easiest way to do it would be to scale back the production of meat. But nobody is going to go for that in terms of law or legislation. No president is going to run on that platform and win, even in a millennial generation 40 years down the line from now. Nobody's going to go for that. Nobody's going to go for that ethically or culturally, because like I said, the number of meat eaters still vastly outnumbers the number of vegetarians and vegans, even in the millennial generations. I think that ultimately people will have to shift to a more plant-based lifestyle simply by necessity, because our population and land cannot sustain it. But by that time, we will be too far gone to make the changes we need to make. And that's kind of a theme here as well. Consider the industrialization in the United States and China, the two biggest polluters on the planet, how China has all these factories belching garbage into the sky, the smoke, and degrading the ozone layer. Like I talked about earlier, in the United States has that as well. We still somehow have coal. We still, have these commuter attitudes where everybody drives in their own individual car. I do it myself. I drive pretty much a gas guzzler because it was cheap and what was available to me at the time with my resources. And that brings me to my next point, which is that people probably won't adopt electric cars. Like meat, there is sort of a cultural element there as well. You can put an electrical thing in any car though, so I think the cultural aspect can be a little bit ignored here. But even if Tesla gets a government contract to put an electric charging station where every gas station is, like there's an electric charger in every gas station, I don't think people will adopt electric cars unless somebody puts up the money to get everybody to trade in their existing cars for an equivalent electric car. Nobody is going to go for that legally. Nobody's going to be able to financially put up enough money, not even fucking Elon Musk, to get enough people driving electric cars in the amount of time that we need them to be driving electric cars, which is basically fucking yesterday. There are scientists out there who believe that we are already too far gone, and I'm not sure that there is a scientific consensus about that yet, but I wouldn't find that hard to believe considering just how slow the movement is on this. I think that one of the most powerful things is that I believe Carl Sagan used to talk about how one of the reasons we didn't meet aliens from another society is simply because we, not only do we exist so far apart in such a vast universe, but it's a very hard litmus test. It's like a natural litmus test given to us by the universe. Can your society make it off-world when, you can make it off-world and hypothetically mine all the resources you need from planets if you survive long enough to master interstellar travel. And the problem is, to get to that point, as a society, you have to collaborate. But how can you collaborate when you have to fight over the limited resources that are on your planet? So that's the sort of catch-22 litmus test of the universe that it gives to us naturally. I believe that most societies will probably destroy themselves fighting over the limited resources on their planet rather than, or before they can go to the stars and get less and less limited resources from, stars and planets and asteroids and shit. They destroy themselves through division and warfare, squabbling over these limited resources before they can just realize that they should have just collaborated and gone interstellar, which is what we'll talk about here in a second. And I do think that probably, more than likely, be it the quick death of nuclear warfare or the slow death by 1,000 cuts, watching our, not only our lifestyle, but our land get erased by global warming, being pushed more towards the center of the country, away from the water, having that population versus land needed for food and meat. Problem get even more exacerbated by the fact that we're moving away from the coast and losing land to rising sea levels. I do think that whether it's that death by 1,000 cuts of climate change or the slow or the quick, fireball of nuclear warfare, I do think that humanity, maybe not in my lifetime, but sometime down the line in the next couple hundred years, will probably fail the universe's litmus test, and we will never see the prosperity of a spacefaring society because we destroyed ourselves before we got to it. And I do think that's sad. Now, I have talked for longer than I intended for this video to even be, and we're just arriving at column B with options C and D, I guess. I've lost the enumeration for this, but the other option versus self-destruction is to become a spacefaring society and go and sort of make big leaps in interstellar travel. And I do believe that's where it's going, because look at SpaceX, look how they're trying to pick up the slack of both the Russian space entity and NASA, where it has just slacked off or failed because of lack of funding, lack of interest, et cetera, et cetera. I do think Elon Musk is a pretty smart person because he believes that, the only other place we can really go now is out. I think I said earlier that there's really no mystery left here on the planet, and with limited resources, the most intelligent thing to do is to go to the stars and see about that and see what we can get from that. But that's a problem because our motivations for going to the stars are a bit wobbly, especially as the situation here on Earth gets a little bit more dire. But first I want to talk about how likely that is, because there's two ways we can go to the stars. We can go to the stars in the sci-fi way, where the Earth is all one government and we're spacefaring and we're conquering new worlds and there's a unified governing body here. And the other option, though, the one I think is more likely, is that we're never going to be unified enough to do this what would probably be considered the quote-unquote right way, the safe way, the responsible way, I think is probably the best word to use for it. Because, and I think Chuck Palahniuk in one of his books talks about how one day when we go to the stars, there might be like a Coca-Cola plant, and each planet will take on the identity of of whichever corporation rapes it first, I think is the wording that he uses. And then there'll be like a Coca-Cola planet or a fucking Planet Denny's or something, or maybe I read that passage in a Denny's or something, I don't know. But I read that a long time ago, and I do think that if we do become a spacefaring society, that we will never be unified enough under one banner to do it responsibly. Every corporation is going to want first dibs, and they're going to go to these planets. And we're not going to have a Coca-Cola planet, I don't think, literally, but we might have a planet. It's going to be not necessarily even just corporations. It's going to be different state entities as well. You might have a planet that can be colonized by, United States interest, and the United States gets those resources, and then you could have, or maybe different areas of the same planet, but you could have one place that's colonized by the United States, one place that is colonized by Russia, and they'll have the same kind of territorial resource conflicts as we have here on Earth if it's not managed by like one governing bodies such as the UN, although of course the UN can only do so much. I don't think that, looking at the UN today, we will ever have a governing body that is powerful enough to rein in the interests of a powerful country like the United States or an equally powerful country like Russia. So I do think we are going to have not only conflicts between, not even a resource race, not necessarily an arms race, but a resource race to the stars and the neighboring planets and the asteroid belts by not only private corporations like SpaceX, who most certainly want a return on their investment. And I mean, I think the whole Coca-Cola planet is a little bit far-fetched because Coca-Cola doesn't necessarily want anything that is out there on asteroids and shit, unless they want to make like a Coca-Cola infused with asteroid powder or something. But I do think we could see corporations using planets or territories on planets or celestial bodies to not only establish resource mining operations, but also to establish their own sort of sovereign states. You could have a Tesla state where, Tesla gets to set the rules, because the UN, what's the UN going to do? Are they going to send like space troopers out to these planets and just, I don't know, it could be entirely dystopian. I don't have necessarily concrete ideas, but it could go so many different ways. You could have, Russia, if Russia had a planet, so to speak, that they colonized, they could hypothetically, or not even Russia, anybody, if any spacefaring country were to colonize a planet, they could commit whatever, human rights violations they wanted to, because it's not like the UN can just fly somebody to a place and examine human rights violations in 8 hours. I mean, it's an entire other celestial body. Whoever gets these planets, be it a corporation or a country or a state, whoever gets these planets first is going to set the rules. They're going to set basically human rights. They're going to set labor laws. They're going to set ownership of all the natural resources there, and it's going to be just a disaster. That is, it's like the current situation here on Earth, exacerbated and expanded out to the planets and the celestial bodies surrounding Earth. And I mean, I would like to see a governing body like the UN regulate these things and have heavy oversight, but when it's on a whole other planet, even if you simplify travel between these planets or make it much faster, I mean, you can only do so much. It's a whole other celestial body. I want to stress that point. So it's hard to police. And hypothetically, if you're able to colonize and or mine these other celestial bodies around us, or even much further than us, corporations and states, government entities would have a lot more leeway to do a lot more exploitative shit to the planets themselves and to the people who are operating the settlements and the factories and the processing and the mining and the refining and shit on that planet. And that is somewhat worrisome to me, because they would basically, it would be a smorgasbord. It'd be whoever gets first dibs gets to do whatever they want on this planet unchecked. And that is pretty frightening when you think about, what contemporary corporations and governments are concerned with, because it's power and it's money and not necessarily the welfare of their people. So that's a problem. And yeah, I think that unfortunately, even if we don't nuke each other or melt the ice caps and drown, I think that's probably the best future. A complex web of corporate and state atrocities being committed on entirely other planets beyond the reach of governing entities that might seek to, in a hypothetical nice sci-fi situation, the UN would be all powerful and have space troopers and fucking just be able to take care of these things. But I think if you look at the UN right now, I mean, it doesn't. I think that the moral of the story here is that if we become a spacefaring world, that we will basically have the same problems, just on a much grander physical scale. And that, I believe, is probably the best hope for the future of humanity. So obviously this has not been a very optimistic video, but I do think those are my honest opinions about what might happen. And I think that no matter where you go, you see the problems we have now, and even if we somehow overcome them, we will just have the same problems every new world we go to and just be repeating our mistakes in a big Sisyphean nightmare. Because I don't think we're ever going to be, unified enough to have that sort of moral global consciousness. Because even people talk about millennials again changing the landscape politically as well, but millennials like money too. There's as many greedy millennials as there are millennials who are socialists and want Bernie to win the election and shit. So we would have. And it only takes one or two. It only takes a few to get on the board of a corporation and get in a spaceship and pilot it to a planet and claim it yours and, start abusing your workforce. And, what if China goes to a planet? We'll have fucking suicide nets on Mars in their factories and their refineries. So not that American work conditions are, entirely that much better, but I do think we have an edge on that a little bit on account of, no suicide nets here in America. But, I do think that humanity is always going to be doomed to repeat its mistakes in any context. And as far as the nuclear aspect that I talked about earlier, I think that we are descending towards the point where it seems more and more likely. And that does worry me as a person who would probably be in the nuclear fallout from New York or something. But yeah, not super optimistic. Twilight Zone episode used to say people are alike all over. Or is that something else? There was some maxim from some work of fiction that says people are alike all over. And I think that's very, very true, because people's motives and the people they elect and the mistakes they make in electing those people are always going to be the same. And you'll see that for all of time, even if we somehow survive to become a spacefaring society. But anyway, I'm repeating myself now. I'm obviously Jesus. Thanks for watching. Next week's video will hopefully be a topic submitted by you. Yes, I mean you. But yeah, I'm obviously Jesus. I will talk to you later next week, Sunday or Monday. I don't know. Peace.